They weren't just cowboys and outlaws, they were broken men, haunted women, and lost souls riding into moral dust storms. The revisionist Western didn't just reshape the genre, it shattered it, exposing the bloody myths and buried truths of the American frontier. These 21 films didn't play by the old rules. They rewrote the book, burned the saloon, and questioned every hero. So saddle up, because these aren't your grandfather's Westerns. They're the stories the West tried to forget. The Wild Bunch. Sam Peckinpah's legendary gunfight opera didn't just push boundaries, it annihilated them. From its slow-motion shootouts to its unflinching portrayal of aging outlaws in a world they no longer understand. The Wild Bunch is more than a Western, it's a requiem. Pike Bishop and his ragtag crew aren't fighting for justice, glory, or even survival. They're fighting for one last sliver of honor in a world that has no place for them. The film was controversial for its graphic violence, but that brutality was the point. The West wasn't noble, it was cruel. In this film, loyalty matters more than law, and redemption must be earned in blood. Peckinpah's direction makes every shot echo like a cannon, every betrayal cut like a knife. With Mexico's revolution looming in the backdrop and the machine gun replacing the revolver, The Wild Bunch didn't just end the Western, it blew it to pieces and made audiences question whether there were ever any real good guys at all. Mccabe and Mrs Miller. Robert Altman turned the Western into a whisper, a fog, a fading photograph. Mccabe and Mrs Miller isn't about shootouts at high noon. It's about murmured deals over whiskey, snow falling on wood planks, and love that never had a chance. John Mccabe is a gambler and small-time businessman. Mrs Miller is a brothel madam with brains and pain to match. Together, they build something close to civilization in the mud-soaked town of Presbyterian Church. But the encroaching greed of big corporations shatters their fragile world. This isn't the story of rugged individualism winning out. It's capitalism crushing dreams under its boot. Altman's use of overlapping dialogue and Leonard Cohen's mournful soundtrack lend the film a poetic sadness. It's a Western where courage is quiet, violence is cowardly, and the hero doesn't ride off into the sunset, but vanishes into a snowstorm. It's not just revisionist, it's revolutionary. Unforgiven. When Clint Eastwood returned to the saddle for Unforgiven, he wasn't the invincible man with no name anymore. He was a haunted relic. William Money is a killer turned pig farmer, a widower trying to stay sober and raise his kids. But when a bounty is put on the heads of two cowboys who mutilated a prostitute, Money straps his guns back on. What follows is not justice, it's vengeance, marinated in regret. Eastwood tears apart the Western myths he helped build. There are no clean kills, no righteous men, no glamorous shootouts, just blood, mud, and ghosts. Morgan Freeman and Gene Hackman offer layered performances as friends and foes who've also lost their grip on morality. Unforgiven isn't about frontier justice. It's about what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. It won Best Picture for a reason. It's not a Western, it's an obituary. Little Big Man. At 121 years old, Jack Crabb has one hell of a story to tell, and it's not the one your history books remember. Little Big Man is a blistering satire that reframes the West through the eyes of a white boy raised by Native Americans, played with wide-eyed wonder and dry wit by Dustin Hoffman. From Custer's arrogance to the brutal massacres of native tribes, the film mocks the very notion of manifest destiny. But beneath its comedy is heartbreak. Jack doesn't just shift between cultures, he survives them, watching cruelty dressed up as civilization. The Cheyenne are portrayed with dignity, wisdom, and warmth, a direct challenge to the old Western stereotype of the savage other. The Battle of Little Bighorn isn't a noble last stand, it's a self-inflicted disaster. Little Big Man was a revelation in 1970 and remains essential for how it skewers the whitewashed Western legacy with both humor and tragedy. Dead Man. Imagine a Western written by Edgar Allan Poe and filmed by Ansel Adams on acid. That's Dead Man, Jim Jarmusch's hallucinatory black-and-white masterpiece starring Johnny Depp as a naive accountant who stumbles into a nightmare. Shot in the heart of the American frontier, this isn't a tale of redemption but of spiritual decay. Depp's character, William Blake, becomes a wanted man, guided through the wilderness by a mystical Native American named Nobody. The film unravels traditional Western tropes. There are no good guys, no bad guys, only wandering souls and mounting bodies. Neil Young's electric guitar score screeches like the ghost of the Old West itself. As Blake descends into a dreamlike trance, the audience is forced to question whether the West ever existed as anything but a violent fever dream. Dead Man doesn't rewrite the Western, it performs its funeral. The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. This isn't the Jesse James legend you grew up hearing. Andrew Dominik's haunting lyrical film deconstructs the myth of the American outlaw and reframes it as a meditation on obsession, fame, and betrayal. Brad Pitt's Jesse is weary and paranoid, a man aware his days are numbered. Casey Affleck's Robert Ford is awkward, insecure, and dangerously enamored, wanting not just to know Jesse, but to become him. As the film inches toward its inevitable climax, it does so with a quiet, unbearable tension. Every whisper, every glance carries the weight of approaching doom. The landscapes are gorgeous, but the characters are fractured. Roger Deakins' cinematography transforms the West into a dream, fading into sepia. This isn't a gunslinging spectacle, it's a funeral dirge. In Ford, we see the birth of American celebrity, a man who becomes famous not for who he is, but for what he did. It's a quiet, devastating masterpiece that asks, what happens when the legend dies and all you're left with is a man? Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Sam Peckinpah returned to the Western with a sorrowful vengeance in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, a film soaked in nostalgia, betrayal, and the fading of the Old West. James Coburn is the weary, resigned Pat Garrett. Chris Christopherson plays the charming, yet doomed Billy the Kid. Once friends, they find themselves on opposite sides of the law, not because they changed, but because the world did. The film is less about good and evil and more about inevitability. As railroad interests push lawmen to clean up the frontier, Garrett becomes the tool of a system he barely respects. Dylan's melancholic score, especially the iconic Knockin' on Heaven's Door, adds a layer of spiritual exhaustion. The West is dying, and so are the men who once ruled it. Shot in a hazy, dusty palette, the film often feels like a half-remembered dream, a lament for freedom, friendship, and youth. It's a ghost story about living men. The Proposition. Set in the brutal Australian outback, The Proposition isn't a Western in the traditional sense, but it drips with the same blood and dust. Written by musician Nick Cave and directed by John Hillcoat, it's a savage tale of justice and moral collapse. When lawman Captain Stanley captures outlaw Charlie Burns, he offers a proposition: kill your older brother Arthur, the most brutal of the gang, or your younger brother Mikey will hang. What follows is a scorching meditation on loyalty, vengeance, and colonial guilt. Guy Pearce plays Charlie as a man torn between codes of honor and family, while Ray Winston's Stanley tries to impose civilization through violent means. The film's landscapes are sun-scorched and merciless, echoing the emotional aridity of its characters. Indigenous characters aren't background, they're witnesses, victims, and echoes of a culture being erased. The Proposition doesn't glorify violence, it reveals its rot. With its poetic dialogue, gut-wrenching decisions, and moral ambiguity, it's one of the most unsettling and unforgettable entries in the revisionist canon. Dances with Wolves. Kevin Costner's directorial debut flipped the Western on its head by putting a white soldier in the boots of a Lakota Sioux tribe and daring to tell their story with respect and scope. Lieutenant John Dunbar isn't just escaping a bloody war, he's finding purpose in a place America had tried to erase. Dances with Wolves portrays the Sioux not as savages, but as fully developed people with customs, humor, and humanity. The film takes its time, letting us see Dunbar's transformation from soldier to Dances with Wolves, as he learns their language and values. What makes this revisionist is how it repositions empathy. The cavalry becomes the villain, and the tribe becomes the home. Costner's sweeping cinematography captures both the beauty and the tension of a frontier on the brink of cultural extinction. Though not without criticism for its white savior arc, the film was a landmark moment for Native representation in Hollywood. It won 7 Academy Awards and brought dignity back to the genre it once degraded. Bone Tomahawk. If classic westerns feared outlaws, Bone Tomahawk fears something far more primal. S. Craig Zahler's debut is a shocking blend of western grit and pure horror. When a woman is abducted by a mysterious tribe of troglodyte cannibals, a small posse, led by Kurt Russell's grizzled sheriff, rides out to rescue her. But this isn't your typical rescue mission. The landscapes are vast and desolate, but the terror lies in the silence, an unsettling dread that builds with each mile. What makes Bone Tomahawk so revisionist isn't just its genre mashup. It's how it reveals the darkness festering beneath the West's so-called civilization. The film doesn't flinch. When violence comes, it's brutal, graphic, and unforgettable. And yet, it's not mindless gore. It's a confrontation with the myth of the noble frontiersman. Here, bravery meets futility, and civilization is just a thin veneer over savagery. The final act is a gut punch, delivering one of the most disturbing sequences in modern Western cinema. You've been warned. The Ballad of Cable Hogue. After redefining violence in The Wild Bunch, Sam Peckinpah stunned audiences with this unexpected, tender revisionist tale. The Ballad of Cable Hogue trades bloodshed for sentiment and dust for dreams. It tells the story of a broken man, Cable Hogue, who, after being left to die in the desert, finds a water spring and builds a business out of nothing. The film is part Western, part comedy, and part love story, but it's ultimately a melancholy reflection on change. Hogue isn't a gunslinger. He's a relic of a vanishing age, making peace with a future that has no room for men like him. Jason Robards gives a soulful performance, and the chemistry with Stella Stevens is both sweet and grounded. What makes this film revisionist is its focus on emotion over action, survival over heroism, and humanity over legend. Peckinpah reminds us that not every Western needs a gunfight. Sometimes all it takes is a well dug in the right place and a man who refuses to disappear. Meeks Cutoff, Kelly Reichardt's. Meeks Cutoff is a quiet rebellion against the masculine myth of the Western. Based on real events from 1845, it follows a group of settlers, mostly women, lost on the Oregon Trail under the questionable leadership of Stephen Meek, a loudmouth guide with little actual knowledge. The genius of the film lies in its silence. Dialogue is sparse, sound is minimal, and the women's whispered worries carry more weight than any shootout. Michelle Williams gives a hauntingly restrained performance, embodying resilience and fear in equal measure. The West here isn't a land of opportunity. It's a barren, unforgiving void. The camera lingers on endless stretches of dry land, broken only by the shifting expressions of those trying not to fall apart. When the settlers capture a native man, the tension boils over, not into violence, but into uncertainty and moral paralysis. The film ends not with answers, but with a question. Meeks Cutoff isn't about conquest. It's about survival, doubt, and the quiet power of the people who history often forgot. Bad Company. Released in the shadow of Vietnam and Nixon's America, Bad Company is a coming-of-age Western that dares to strip away every illusion about the frontier. Directed by Robert Benton, it follows a young Civil War draft dodger, Drew, who joins a ragtag band of outlaws led by the charismatic Jake. But this isn't an adventure. It's a slow, grim spiral into desperation. The boys are not heroes. They're scared, hungry, and unprepared. What makes this film so revisionist is its honest portrayal of youth, corrupted by a violent world. The cinematography is bleak and beautiful, capturing the cold indifference of nature. There are no gunfights scored with rousing music, only messy, sudden bursts of violence that leave scars. The film whispers what most Westerns scream: the West wasn't won. It was stolen, and many of its takers lost their souls in the process. Bad Company is the death of the Western dream, told through the eyes of boys forced to grow up too fast in a land that doesn't care. The Homesman. In The Homesman, Tommy Lee Jones and Hilary Swank take us on a ride across a landscape so emotionally barren it's almost post-apocalyptic. Swank plays Mary B. Cuddy, a devout, lonely woman tasked with transporting 3 mentally ill women across the brutal plains of Nebraska. She enlists the help of George Briggs, a claim jumper with no moral compass, played by Jones himself. What follows is a soul-shattering journey through trauma, survival, and gender roles rarely explored in Westerns. The women aren't victims of war or raids. They've been broken by marriage, isolation, and loss. Mary B. is strong, moral, and shockingly self-sufficient, but society sees her as too bossy, too plain, and ultimately disposable. The West in The Homesman isn't a place of freedom. It's a prison without walls. This film dares to center women's pain in a genre that has long ignored it. The ending isn't triumphant, it's harrowing, and that's exactly what makes it unforgettable. Heaven's Gate. Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate may have bombed at the box office, but time has transformed it into a masterpiece of revisionist cinema. Loosely based on the Johnson County War, the film follows a Harvard-educated sheriff caught between greedy cattle barons and a community of poor immigrants they intend to exterminate. Cimino spares no detail in showing the systemic brutality and ethnic cleansing at the heart of American expansion. It's a film about class warfare, exploitation, and the cost of being caught in the middle. The scale is epic, the visuals stunning, and the atmosphere bleak. Isabel Huppert and Christopher Walken add emotional and political complexity to a tale soaked in loss. Despite its troubled production and bloated runtime, Heaven's Gate is one of the most ambitious Westerns ever made. Its fatal flaw was perhaps being too honest about what America did to build itself. It's not entertainment. It's a reckoning. Jeremiah Johnson. In Jeremiah Johnson, Robert Redford portrays a war veteran who turns his back on society to live as a mountain man. What begins as a journey toward peace becomes a blood-soaked confrontation with both nature and man. The film challenges the Western trope of the lone man thriving in the wilderness. Instead, Johnson is humbled again and again by the land, the seasons, and the haunting consequences of violence. He befriends Native Americans, marries into a tribe, and briefly finds purpose, until it all comes crashing down. After a senseless massacre, Johnson becomes a near-mythical figure of revenge, endlessly drifting through the snow-covered Rockies. But the film refuses to glorify him. It is a story of alienation, of losing one's humanity in pursuit of freedom, and realizing that freedom can be just another kind of prison. The silence of the film says more than any gunshot. This is a Western where loneliness kills more than bullets. Hostiles. Christian Bale gives one of his most emotionally raw performances in Hostiles, a film set in 1892 that explores hatred, grief, and reconciliation on the edge of civilization. He plays Captain Joseph Blocker, a soldier known for ruthlessly killing Native Americans. When he's ordered to escort a dying Cheyenne chief and his family back to their tribal lands, he reluctantly agrees, beginning a journey that forces him to confront his own brutality. Along the way, they are joined by a grieving settler woman, and the line between enemy and ally begins to dissolve. The film doesn't offer forgiveness easily. Every step through the hostile terrain is weighed down by trauma, war, and loss. Director Scott Cooper gives us a West that's both physically and morally barren. There are no heroes here, only people trying to survive their past. Hostiles strips away the romance of the frontier and reveals what was always underneath, a history of violence begging for healing. El Topo. Alejandro Jodorowsky's El Topo is like nothing else in Western cinema. It's a surrealist acid trip, a spiritual fable, and a violent deconstruction of the gunslinger myth all wrapped into one. Jodorowsky plays a black-clad gunfighter on a metaphysical quest to defeat 4 mystical masters and reach enlightenment. But each duel takes him further into madness and self-destruction. Blood gushes like paint, religious symbols collide, and the film's structure dissolves into chaos. What makes El Topo so revolutionary is its audacity. It treats the Western as a myth to be torn apart and rebuilt through psychedelic imagery and spiritual agony. It's violent, grotesque, and deeply symbolic, showing the gunslinger not as a hero but as a deeply flawed seeker, forever lost in a broken world. Revered by cult cinephiles and influential to filmmakers like Tarantino and Lynch, El Topo rewrote the Western not with realism, but with metaphysical fire. One-Eyed Jacks. Marlon Brando's lone directorial effort, One-Eyed Jacks, is a Western built on betrayal, vengeance, and repressed emotion. Brando plays Rio, an outlaw left for dead by his former partner, Dad Longworth, who has reinvented himself as a respectable lawman. Years later, Rio returns, not just to settle the score, but to confront the man who shattered his trust. Unlike traditional Westerns, One-Eyed Jacks doesn't paint in black and white. Rio is both sympathetic and volatile. Longworth is both coward and father figure. The California coastal settings are lush and windswept, far from the usual dusty towns. Brando infuses the film with psychological depth, sensual tension, and an undercurrent of sorrow. At its core, it's a story of emotional wounds that never heal. Critics at the time didn't appreciate its complexity, but today it stands as a moody, morally rich precursor to the revisionist wave that followed. The Long Riders. What happens when outlaws become a family, and that family becomes legend? The Long Riders, directed by Walter Hill, offers a stylized but gritty take on the Jesse James gang. Uniquely cast with real-life brothers, David, Keith, and Robert Carradine, James and Stacy Keach, Dennis and Randy Quaid, the film emphasizes the deep, often unspoken bonds between men bound by blood and crime. But there's no glamour here. The gang's descent into violence is tragic, inevitable, and bloody. Hill's use of slow motion, especially in the Northfield bank robbery scene, makes every bullet feel personal. There's a sadness to this film, a sense that these men are caught in a cycle they can't escape. The West they dreamed of is dying, and the future holds only prison or death. The Long Riders is a eulogy, not just for outlaws, but for the myth of outlaw heroism itself.